What we're going to be looking at today is the repatriation debate, and I'll just sketch in some of the background stuff, which I'm sure you all know. So here's Fabian Ware, who goes out under the aegis of the British Red Cross, this 44-year-old Edwardian polymath and kind of mini Renaissance prince. And he very quickly, as I'm sure you all know, realises that the graves are not being recorded and registered properly, and starts doing that on behalf of the Red Cross and liaising with the army, with the Adjutant General, as to registrations. So we're getting burials at the front behind the lines occurring from 1914. Now, during 1915, gradually the army is taking more and more notice of this, partly, of course, through the brutal accountancy mechanics of the army. It needs to know when it's striking people off the strength, and knowing where they're buried, it helps with that process. So we gradually get the creation of the Directorate of Graves Registration and Inquiries units, and they become particularly attached at corps and army level, and they begin coordinating the burial processes and recording of burials and dealing with inquiries from people from across the empire. And here you can see the number 3 section in Ibra, and notice the range of cap badges from one can be worked out. Graves registration units are often older men returning from wounds, who are then kind of pushed sideways a little bit to do this kind of work. And so here you can see that the burials behind the lines start to become more and more complex, where units have the ability to create memorials for their own men. They will often do so, despite the fact that the Graves Registration Unit has its own standardised cross that it will end up deploying, but units often build things for their own men. I'm sure some of you must have seen those incredible enamel plaques that the West Lancashire Division produced for its graves. So there is a variety of grave marking processes, but we can see that the grave site is important and is becoming routinized, shall we say, and therefore the establishment of the cemeteries is literally burying itself into the landscape during 1915. But repatriation is going on. It's one of those great mysteries of the Great War, isn't it? Precisely how many men were brought back home. Certainly there were considerable numbers. One occurs near the city where I now live, of Canterbury, and it's a very public one. Vernon Austin, who you can see just how public this is. There's his funeral cortege in Canterbury High Street. So he is brought home. Now, for someone like Ware, a former newspaper man, a great propagandist for imperial integration, a great believer in that concept, this very quickly to him, using those PR antennae, shall we say, he realises this is a divisive issue, because clearly this is something which only the rich and the influential can afford. So he's determined to stamp out on the policy, and it's in the wake of Gladstone's, William Gladstone's body, grandson of the great Prime Minister, being brought home, that he manages to persuade, not with actually too much work, the army to agree with him that there should be a repatriation ban. So there we go. There's the first exhumation ban of April 1915. Now, at this moment in time, right, this is purely a wartime only temporary measure. There are fears about hygiene. There are lots and lots of ongoing human fears, that dead bodies are sources of contagion and disease, so moving bodies around is problematic. Obviously, moving them through the various layers of military traffic and the kind of the sense of the diversion of manpower, or if a civilian firm is going to be contracted to do this, the degree of army bureaucracy that's going to have to be dragged into giving them passes, allowing them to do this kind of stuff. So there's a whole series of, or a whole group of factors are coming together to make sure that exhumation is banned and repatriation is banned, and that will be reissued in October 1916. Interestingly, of course, just at that moment where some of the Somme lines have advanced a little bit, so there is more work being done on what we might call the original no man's land of the Somme battle, and this issue is now coming up again as bodies are being found and identified. The cemeteries in France and Belgium actually start to become part of wartime propaganda as well, particularly when the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps is put to work on grave tending duties. And of course, there is a deep cultural symbolism of this. Women as bearers of children, women as nurses and mothers, and then here at the end of the life, and there is a deep Judeo-Christian thing going on here, women as Mary, they're at the point of death and maintaining the vigil at the grave, just as it's women that are the first to see the resurrected Christ. So there is a deep Christian message going on here that is kind of subliminal in the propagandizing of this as well. So there you can see a cemetery with a WAC working with GRU unit guys. Now, as one of the offshoots of the Imperial War Conference in the spring of 1917, the agreement is passed that there should be an Imperial War Graves Commission. Fabian Ware, as head of the DGRU, always really had his eye on the post-war. I think always had his eye on the idea that these men are going to remain here. He's been involved in all sorts of negotiations with the French government about the land for cemeteries, and the implications in all of those agreements is really that it's going to become permanent. That's the subliminal implication. He knows this. So the Imperial War Graves Commission being set up in May 1917 gives him the chance to start doing some planning, some forward planning, and he's very much onto that. And one of the great things, one of the great kind of legal powers he gets straight away via the French government is that the French government recognises the War Office as the only legal authority that it will deal with regarding British military burials in France. And in turn, really, the War Office delegates that authority to the new Imperial War Graves Commission. So where is in the box seat? This is important for post-war things. Who has rights? Individual families or a unique imperial organisation? And legally, the way the French government views it, it's the IWGC via the War Office. Now, he's put his great friend Sir Frederick Kenyon, director of the British Museum, to work to explore options for permanent commemorative processes. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, Sir Edwin Lutyens, Herbert Baker go across the Channel in July 1917 with Charles Aitken of the Tate Gallery to look at the cemeteries and to start thinking up some ideas, essentially think up some ideas about what they can do. Kenyon brings all of that together. And importantly, he's the guy that I think is often written out of this story because he's often thought of as the shall we say, the Salieri to Lutyens' genius, which is Reginald Blomfield. It's Blomfield in many ways in February 1918 who glues most of this stuff together. Now, the first Kenyon report, although there is some public knowledge of it, the full details of it are not made public, right? This is an internal document only in the spring of 1918. So the public are told that the IWGC has kind of moved forward, has had a report circulated, but the full details of it are not there. That will come soon after the armistice, when the full nature of the Kenyon report, it's distributed to the press, and it's there. There will be permanent cemeteries. There will be headstones, not crosses. There will be this thing which will become known as the War Stone or the Stone of Remembrance, and this other thing which will become known as the Cross of Sacrifice. So it's put into the public sphere at this amazingly volatile time. The armistice has just come. There's going to be a general election. I think there's a little bit of where's newspaper mind that, to use modern parlance, is thinking this is a good way of burying what might be bad news to some, isn't it? We'll go public, but we're going to go public when there's a welter of other stuff going on. So it's going to take a little bit of time for people across the British Empire to compute what this really means. Because I think for a lot of people in the early days, they're thinking, oh, right, that's for those who don't want their bodies back, right? Isn't this great? A corporate uniform solution has been put together for those families who do not wish their loved ones to be repatriated. That's lovely, but it doesn't affect me because I want my one back. And it's only slowly, is this going to start to come through? So on what's happening out, particularly in France and Belgium, is there's a division of labour. The IWGC, as it says there, begins surveying, designing and planning, and the GRU is doing concentrating, is doing battlefield searches, is bringing guys in. But of course they're working in very close collaboration, and it's only really in the last stages of the war that Ware gives up his directorship of the DGRE to concentrate entirely on IWGC work. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, that exhumation work is psychologically and physically very damaging and appalling, because it is a dreadful scenario. These guys often camping out on the battlefields from Monday to Friday. They will then come back in to places like Ypres or Amiens after spending a week under canvas in the desolation of the battlefields. And then it's actually no wonder that they do a fair amount of that once they're in places like Amiens, and sometimes that there is some disciplinary issues there. But I think it's entirely understandable given the nature of the work. So there you've got a nicely posed portrait photograph of a GRU team at work fulfilling all of the strict processes of the GRU to make sure there is proper recording and identification, if at all possible. So here is where the IWGC is in that very lively winter of 1918 is chucking down another card. So just so no one can say you weren't warned. It clarifies its position. It remains firm on the repatriation ban. But I think it's still kind of getting through people's heads because there's a lot going on. Others, some people who have got who are suffering bereavement, of course, are also looking forward to another family relative being demobilised. So that there's a lot going on in heads in that winter of 1918, as well as the general election. Now, where you're going to have a very interesting kind of what we might say side project, alternative project, which is going to help the IWGC in some ways, of course, is in the idea of the unknown warrior, the one who will be formally repatriated and who is going to stand for all. The person who is very likely, in all of the rhetoric about the unknown warrior, to be a man of lower ranks. So the man of lower rank will lie in the Hall of Kings, and princes like Battenberg will lie with ordinary men in France and Belgium. And so there's this kind of yin and yang, this beautiful yin and yang that occurs thanks to the symbolism of the unknown warrior. And I think that's going to help the IWGC in its wider arguments about the sanctity of non-repatriation and the one that stands for all. Now, of course, there is going to be a fight for personal choice, but it's actually led to the fascinating thing, the really, really interesting thing about this, right? If you think, for the vast majority of British people, the only people that get buried by the state are the very, 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 very good or the very, 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 very lowly. those who get workhouse pauper burials. And it's the fear of the pauper burial which had driven on those late 19th century burial clubs, that things like the Cooperative Society ran, right? So that you had a decent send-off for your relative. So what's fascinating, given that working class concern for a decent send-off, which they themselves, to use our modern term, have agency over, is how little evidence there is of formal protest about the commission coming from the lower stratas of British society. Most of it is from the richest, the most influential end, and the middle class. And you don't really see that. Now, of course, that might be just simply because that evidence is lost, because they didn't produce enough that's durable in the historical record. But given the fact that the British are voracious newspaper readers and correspondents, and newspapers like to fill column inches, you'd like to think that you might start to see some element, of shall we say, lower class, where you can identify lower class protest here, but it's very, very difficult to come up with. Instead, what we see are things like this. Lady Selborne, who's by birth in the Cecils, and married into the Cecils, and her family, there's a lot of connection with the Cecil family. They are leading the campaign against this. And you can see this ultimate irony that Fabian Ware, the arch-Tory imperial paternalist, is being thought of in that way that Jacob Rees-Mogg now calls everyone that he doesn't like a dangerous socialist, right? So it's the socialist spirit. This collective opinion is the socialist spirit. And the conscription of bodies is worthy of Lenin. And this also reminds us, doesn't it, that the Britain that fights the Great War is a liberal with a capital L, even it survives that coalition, and a small L country. The right of the individual, the guardianship against the big state is inherent in the mindsets of these people. And here we see this amazing thing, don't we? This truly weird, unique thing that's going to happen in British history, that men's, and indeed it's going to come close to female bodies, are being conscripted whilst alive and then are also held onto in death. It is quite remarkable. So the debate, who does have authority? This is Henry Hopkins, a Canadian, writing to Ware and the Commission. You can see, but we are the parties, we the bereaved, the family are the parties who have authority in this matter. The body is ours, his son's body. It does not belong to the Imperial War Graves Commission. In fact, we have more authority in this than ever. So the dispute is starting. There, Henry Hopkins writing to Sir George Purley, the Canadian High Commissioner and the Canadian representative on the Commission, demanding the right to dig the body up and have it returned home. But as I said, what's really interesting when you look at the class background of so many of these people, it's from the usually from the upper middle class as well, up into the ranks of the aristocracy. So it's there. And the wartime exhumations have created confusion. So here's Albert Ball, when Albert Ball's father, when it looks as if the German cemetery that young Albert is buried in is going to have to be dug up and concentrated, the Commission write to him and say, we've got a few cemeteries, in mind. Should this occur, your son's body will move to one of these cemeteries. And he says, well, if you have to dig him up, he's coming home. The Commission say, sorry, we don't send people home. That's nonsense, he said. I went to Vernon Austin's funeral in Canterbury in the war. And of course, the Commission have to then shamefacedly and rather sheepishly write back and say, oh, that was kind of before we nailed everything down, so don't use that as a precedent. Don't use that the policy has moved on. So there is a sort of thundering correspondence between Albert Ball Sr. And the Commission. So those wartime, repatriations did cause confusions. Now, another variant occurs, right, where some people are starting to realise, okay, so they've kind of either stitched me up here or even I go along with this decision. They stay where they are, but I don't believe in exhumation for local reburial. I do not believe in concentration. So that's another kind of subtlety that comes out in 1919. This is particularly important for those of deeper Roman Catholic faith, where that's going to be more important. Obviously, as well, what's really important here is Muslim opinion for the wider imperial one, because there's a deep antipathy to exhumation and reburial there as well. So that argument's coming up. You know, if my son, my husband, or whatever is going to stay there, just leave them in exactly where they were buried. And of course, in some instances, the Commission can agree with that. In other instances, they're going to ride over that and concentrate. Then we get another subtlety. Well, all right, if you're holding on to the body, I've got to be able to design the memorial. It's got to be one, you know, we have a family, a funereal mason whose family, you know, have buried my family for centuries, or whatever it might be. We're going to commission our own design. And there's another argument for you, a dictatorship, particularly the dictatorship of the headstone. One of the few things that had linked at times the occasionally standoffish and cool relationship between Baker, Blomfield and Lutchins is their common agreement on headstones. Headstones for a multiracial, multi-faith empire work. Headstones you can tell the story of a person on. It's literally a tablet on which you can tell something about them. And finally, very important for architects, aesthetics. As they say, rows of crosses, particularly when the sunlight is in certain directions, create a very ugly effect on the eye, and they are thinking with their aesthetic hat on. But that's not good enough, you know, for certain people. And you can remember why. The war is sold as a crusade. The war is a crusade against Prussian imperialism. Remember what Winnington Ingram, the Bishop of London, says. This country never did a more Christ-like thing than when it took up arms against Germany. This is a war of the mailed fist against the nailed hand. Crucifixion is everywhere in the Great War. So the cross is really important. And the Commission are not going for that, at least as a grave marker. So we see more complaints. But again, loudly from a relatively small group, from what I can work out. So there's Lord Balfour making this point. If they're going to remain, then surely we have the right to decide what goes on it. And this is what happens, right? This is where's terror realised when the family has got in first. I'm sure every one of you here has been to the so-called aristocrat cemetery in Zillebecker churchyard. There's the Baron de Gunsberg in his big granite tomb at the back. There's the Steer family, you know, where they've put up their own cross. Now, the Commission is going to do that most beautiful of British compromises here. You know, these are the bits that make me proud. It will say to families that have put these up, we can, you know, dig up your permanent private memorial and send it home to you. It's a bit cagey about who's paying the costs at this point, but that's the option he's put in front. Or we can put our monument, our own headstone, right in front of it. So you'll get two. Some families go for that. If you're going to Ypres Town Cemetery, have a look on the main Menin Road. If you're going through that gate on the Menin Road, just look on the right-hand side and you'll see one where there's a headstone in front of a cross. Relatively few take that up. But this is where it's fair realised, right? Inequality in death. This is the wrong message that the British Empire that has come together in this sacred cause, this is the wrong public message to put out. It's certainly the wrong message for in perpetuity, for their name liveth forevermore. So, one of the big players in all of this, or one of the big middle class voices in all of this, is going to be Sarah Smith of Leeds and the British War Graves Association. And she very much allies herself with the Cecils, with Lady Selborne, and is fighting, first of all, for the idea of repatriation. She holds various meetings, usually in Leeds. They are well attended. There's no doubt about it. You know, and it drags in people from across Yorkshire, from across the ridings. It's less clear from any of the evidence whether she's anything more than a very important regional protest group. I can't find much evidence, say, of people from London, or even Manchester, just coming across the Pennines and joining these meetings and signing her various petitions. But she is very vociferous, a perfect example of what historians of Edwardian and Victorian, late Victorian gender have shown of somehow women who, for lack of other opportunities, the one that they do grab, kind of sublimate themselves in it and chuck every energy that they've got into it. And as a bereaved mother, this is certainly her campaign. This is what she is onto. Now, she grabs hold of the fact that in Leeds, in the city cemetery, there is a man, a local man who's buried, who ends up there because of his peripatetic life and ended up serving with the American forces. Now, the Americans, as she keeps pointing out, have a repatriation policy. So if a British American, as it were, can end up being brought home, why can't our guys? And obviously, that's exactly the same argument that's going on in Canada. As the Canadians call them, their noisy neighbours are making it very, very, very clear. Any Canadian, particularly, as we know, most of the big Canadian cities are very close to the parallel. They often read American newspapers. They're picking up on this, that the Americans are repatriating, so why aren't we? And the Canadians are standing firm. That's what you'll often find. Where's mini parliament that he makes in the Imperial War Graves Commission of imperial voices? They will often stand together more firmly, shall we say, than their home governments will at times. It's a very interesting, enclosed little world of kind of agreement and consensus that we're very skillfully puts together there. So we see Smith leading the British War Graves Association. Voluminous, great letter writer. She is always writing letters to the local press. She gets a petition together, a mass petition, which she wants Queen Mary to look at. She sends it to the Commission. The Commission go through it with a fine-tooth comb and then find that it's very much like the Great Charter, for those of you who remember having to do your 19th century British history, that names are repeated again and again, and there's almost like the implication that Patch, the family dog, has been asked to put their signature on it, their paw print. And so there is a bit of scepticism about it. But what we can't deny here is the sheer passion and the pain that's at the heart of this, and this sense of being robbed of something that is so important to the bereavement process: the graveside, the body, the right to shape the way that body and that person is commemorated. So she certainly goes wild. She writes to the King Albert of the Belgians. She says, surely you can contradict and cut through all of these regulations and these so-called agreements that the Commission is trying to sign with you. Not going to be much movement there. Writing to slamming Worthington Evans, the Secretary of State for War, lots of lobbying. So a tireless lobbyer on this behalf. But, of course, what's also happening, as we know, in 1919, what Alan Borg referred to, as the largest civic arts project ever to occur in this country, is unfurling, which is the War Memorials movement. And as we know, in some ways, I think some of the passion that's sublimated into the War Memorials movement is as people realise that they're not going to get repatriation. So the War Memorial, the local civic or church memorial or club memorial, whatever it might be, becomes your surrogate headstone, becomes your surrogate cemetery. This is the place where your lost loved one is. In effect, they're all doing the Lord Plumer thing of the Men in Gate. He is not missing, he is here. Right? That's where it is. So that's forcing that on. And you'll see, I mean, that's a letter to the Scotsman, which is basically saying, churchyards as alternative homes, for either individual or group memorials is the way to go, right? This is the way forward. So we will see that energy, that desire, that passion, that emotion go find its own other, what we might call natural outlets here. And of course, the Empire is striking back, as it were. Where, back to this point of being a great propagandist, he's got Kipling on board as the literary advisor, and I'm sure many of you have seen The Graves of the Fallen booklet that's produced with those beautiful illustrations by Douglas Macpherson, where they're showing. They're saying, right, so this is what we want to do, right? Don't judge until you've seen it. Go along with us, stick with us, watch this project unfold, and believe me, you're going to love it. It's essentially the idea here. You're going to find that this sums up your grief and your pride perfectly. Trust us. That's what they're doing. And of course, from our perspective, this looks really quite weird, doesn't it? Because it's a group of white, well-educated, essentially upper class, slightly older men who are making these collective decisions on behalf of everyone. But thank goodness they did come up with a sublime job on it. So in France and Belgium, the IWGC teams there, the junior architects, the assistant architects, coordinated by Charles Holden, are working away particularly at Saint-Omer in the old buildings that headquarters left when they moved over to Montreuil. They take over a lot of that. They've been there, and they are working away on the ground. So there's somewhere like Kemmel Chateau Cemetery, which Goldsmith was the assistant to Lutyens on that. And you can see that's where new grave markers are going in. They've been verifying the plots, and they've got new markers about to be put up as they've gone through the cemetery verification process. And then there's the rush, because of all this going on in the background. There is this rush to turn design concept into reality. So here's one of the so-called experimental cemeteries, which they're very close to actually in the summer of 1918. If they could have got on with this, they would have done to build one. There's a lot of discussion about where we're going to get the stone from. The Royal Engineers quarries at Masengi are approached, and of course Masengi will end up producing a lot of stone, local stone for the commission. So there's one of the experiments. Holden's sublime one at Louvencourt. I don't believe that Blomfield claims that. That's a Holden, if you ask me. I'm not dogmatic about it. I'm prepared to argue the toss. And then Forceville, which is another experiment, but the one that's thought to be the best model in its mixture of design features, of horticulture and architectural features. And that's the one that will become the model for the building. And of course, it works. You get the public affirmation. You get exactly what Ware is hoping for. He makes sure the press see these cemeteries. We get the great Beatrix Bryce, she who's going to form the Ypres League, who's a big propagandist for the importance of Ypres to the British Empire. And you can see, here is the fact that modernism does not take over in the 1920s, isn't it? Look at all this great Tennyson, ideals of the king stuff that's still going on. Chivalry, knighthood, heroism, self-sacrifice from age to age are knit together here, breathing from the cross, from the graven heraldry of our history in arms, from the names of these, the flower of the manhood of our race. So the beauty of the site does exactly what Ware is hoping for. It's going to dampen down some of the complaints and the problems. And a test case, a great test case, is Maurice of Battenberg. Beatrice thinks, first of all, that she can bring him home. Then she realises that she can't, so she says, OK, my guys have designed a grave marker for him. No, you're not going to get that. It goes on and on and on. It's eventually picked up by the news of the world because, essentially she does say, well, my nephew's going to sort this out and he's the king. And her nephew says, no, Auntie, you are having... Maurice is having exactly the same headstone as everybody else. And it's then, as soon as she gives in on that headstone is put up almost overnight. Ware says, get it done, it's going to go in, that's it. And he also says, this is quite interesting, he also says, make sure it's a really good one, right? Because this is test case propaganda for him to dampen all this down. But the issue never quite fades away. Dominic's a great expert on this. The continuing of exhumation scandals and stories, because this is, of course, what it becomes. Once the commission gets its carte blanche in that famous debate of May 1920 in the Commons, where all of the arguments are thrashed out, and in the end it doesn't go to the vote, and the IWGC's preferred approach is accepted, hence why the experimental cemeteries, there's a rush to get them done. But once you've got that moment, then it really has underlined the fact that any attempt to move a body really is, not just illegal in strict legality terms, it's also immoral now. So there's a moral and a legal issue, but nonetheless, it's going on. So we get these stories in the Express, where, as a newspaper man, rips what's left of his nice Edwardian locks out. He writes to the editor of the Express, "Didn't you think of talking to us, before you published a story about illegal exhumations?" And some of them kind of implied that IWGC officials on the ground turned a blind eye to it, or knew that it was going on and didn't really feel that it was worth making a fuss about. So he's really upset about this. He says, talk to us if you want to run a story like that. And quelle surprise, they never learn. They come back to it again. So we get more stories, British war dead smuggled home. And it implies, that virtually every night there are almost like rowing boats in the channel with coffins or biscuit tins, with whatever was left of some poor beggar being brought home. And it's almost like, the implication is almost like it's a drug smuggling network, where there's intermediaries and there are kind of low-level operators and big guys. So it's almost similar to, though, the people smuggling that we have now. There's kind of some of the same rhetoric about it. But I think what's most damaging to the Commission is sometimes, say, the implications in them that the Commission isn't doing its job properly, isn't policing this properly, and or is still trampling on people's opinion. So it feels, in a kind of catch-22 that it can't win. So if we do a quick case study, here's a famous one, Anna Dury, a Canadian, and she advertises what she's going to try and do to the Commission. That I'm going to try and get my son's body dug up. And her first attempt goes completely wrong because it's in the middle of the night. The noise seems to attract some attention. Remember, we're still talking about some devastated zones, and so it's deadly quiet at night. If something happens, people hear it. The horse and cart that are meant to take the coffin off, the guys bolt because they think police are going to arrive, and it all collapses. So the first attempt is a bit of a fiasco. She goes back for a second successful attempt, but this is where it becomes appalling. Like this is where you can see, that this E-Day fix, the appalling psychological repercussions of grief and what it must have done to some people. It's all been fixated on this idea of repatriating the son's body, and look what happens. The coffin was found to have been forced open. The timbers had been broken and displaced, and the zinc shell had been cut upwards from the foot. The coffin was empty with the exception of a few small pieces of bone and some fragments of the officer's clothing. The coffin had not been opened up for its whole length, but apparently the contents had been scraped out. So you have this scenario, don't you? This amazingly complex, pathetic, sad scenario where a grieving mother has, in some ways, knowingly desecrated her own son's body because the desperation so much, the sense of it will all be all right once he's buried at home. Once I can then go to the headstone or whatever it is, and I see my own one, my own hometown, that makes this worthwhile. So the psychological wound sometimes, the determination to see these things through, and what it might lead to. And there it is. He's home. That's it. Being reported in the local press as well. And interestingly, for reasons I can't quite work out, and I think it is all to do with Ware saying, let this be tomorrow's chip wrappings. We're not going to start any real legal proceedings. We're not going to go down that route. That's not the way to go. It's flies in the air for a few days. It's noticed in the local newspapers, and then we just go silent about it. And that's his response. There aren't going to be any big kind of legal cricket bats brought in to smack this case around. When it comes to Thomas Hopkins, he's a famous one. The family arrange for him to be exhumed, so he's taken out of the ground at Tyncott. He's taken to Antwerp. He's about to be loaded onto a ship, and there's a kind of Keystone Cops chase across Belgium as they realise what's happened, and just before the body is loaded onto the ship, it's blocked, and that's why you end up with a casualty of the Ypres salient buried in the IWGC plot in Antwerp Cemetery, that far away, from the battlefields. And of course, if you go to the cemetery, you'll see where it was, where it happened. The gap is still there. So it is occurring even once the IWGC had got on with its permanent commemoration job, but in very, 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 very small numbers. And I shall let joy be unconfined. I'm about to shut up here, and that perhaps will leave us for a bit wider discussion. I can hear the bells of Thanksgiving ringing out around the room. He's about to shut up. As we're saying, these psychological reactions to the loss of a body, I think, carry on for years and years and years, and do leave strange effects and understandable effects on certain people, right? This is Mel Hawkins, Australian, comes over, suddenly she's there in France. No one knows how, in September 1951. Here you can see these very delicate reports from the Commission's team. It's near Péronne, where her former fiancé is buried. And she's absolutely convinced, this poor woman, that if she can exhume her fiancé's grave, peace will descend on the world, that the spirit of world is bottled up in his body. So the grave has to be exhumed for the good of all. And so these commission officials say, there's this poor woman, there's obviously something not quite right with her. And she keeps coming and she keeps saying, we've got to open up this grave. And she says the Australian ambassador should come up, come out and help her with all of this. Oh, sorry, let me just go back. So what happens? In the end, they persuade her to go back to London. They go back to Britain, where she says she's got some relatives in London. And virtually every day for months, she comes in to the Baker Street and Winchester Square, Winchester House offices on St James's Square, saying, "Are you ready yet? Have you got the legal papers so we can go and exhume him? We've got to do this." And the Australian High Commission's on the case. They're trying to work out, because she doesn't seem to have too much money. Can we get her home? And this, unfortunately, in the Commission's files, this case just peters out. But here we can see this lingering fact, the need to engage, to commune with the body, and some of its the tragedies of the absent body. Now, women are at the heart of all of this. They're often at the heart of this debate, and there you see the imitation of Christ, the Thomas à Kempis, dragged out of the Middle Ages and put into our own world, that each man suffered as Christ did, and therefore you can see some of the debates as to why the cross as a grave marker was so impassioned, and it's placating women that's often thought to be the heart of the IWGC's, public communications policy. If you look at the war graves passes, for those who are entitled to war graves passes, it starts with women. That's where the entitlement starts. Bereaved mother, bereaved wife, they're first on the list. And then sisters outrank brothers. There is a really strict gender hierarchy on the eligibility for a war graves pass. So visiting then becomes crucial to the grieving process, doesn't it? And as I'm sure you all know, starting as soon as the war ends, you get all of those institutions that were there on the Western Front to keep Tommy happy and away from the wet canteen. They all chuck themselves into work to help and support war graves visitors. So we get things like the Church Army. There's its War Graves Visitation Department, the Salvation Army, when St Barnabas comes into it. And they are often putting the female bereaved at the heart of all of this. And you can certainly see in the public discourse that happens. The foregrounding of women at the unveiling of the men engaged, that women almost have first dibs, as it were, on getting the wound healed by seeing the site. They have to go there. There again, in meetings with King Albert, and there's Plumer there. And you see in that all of the illustrated press are picking up on that. And there again, that the sort of pathetic status, in the true meaning of that term, of the widow and the bereaved mother. This is what it's all about. And there, those who are regarded, as I'm sure you know, and if not, buy my book about this. Handy for keeping open those doors that won't stay. That coffee table's a bit wonky, and in an emergency, soft, strong, and thoroughly absorbent. The difference between the pilgrim and the tourist is encapsulated here. The gulping tourist versus the heartbroken pilgrim, which is the widow. There she is, Lucy Blake, her first husband's grave with her son. That need to see the place, and then hopefully to come back and see it once the permanent solution is in place, once the final architectural and horticultural vision is there. And St Barnabas Hostels is interesting, and again in St Barnabas Hostels, when they're doing their appeals for funds, this is like their go-to image. And notice that it's obviously an aged mother. It's not a guy standing, it's not his old dad or even his brother. It's the mum, it's the aged mother being there that's really important. And another one, see, back when it's formally had its work over, when it's got all its permanent elements and features in place. And there, if it's a case of the missing, because of course that's the other bit that's chucked in to the repatriation debate throughout, and that's the bit that Kipling leads on. He pretty much says, this is it, don't go on about your known body, think about us that have nothing. We have nowhere to go until we think of a good solution, a good collective way of dealing with the missing. And that's a very powerful argument to chuck into it, because of course it then goes back in to that wartime rhetoric which everyone had drummed into them about collective sacrifice and sharing the equality of sacrifice. So you can't privilege one over the other, and therefore the best way of ensuring there is equality is to leave it in the hands of the commission. So there's the journey's end, for an Australian woman having her photograph done at her son's name on the Menin Gate Memorial. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for listening. What you can see is that the position of the individual dead body is one of great emotion, of great high rhetorical power in the 20s and 30s. And what I ultimately going to argue rightly, I think what the Imperial War Graves Commission was right and was wonderful at doing was holding its nerve, seeing down all oppositions, and by employing the highest of possible standards, making a statement unique in the commemoration of any dead, in any cause, which has stood the test of time, and we'll now walk to see how it goes over the next centenary. Thank you all very much for listening.